We're here today with Jan-Philipp Sendker. He is broadcasting to us from Berlin, Deutschland. He's taking a break. He's actually at a dinner party, guys. And after he finishes speaking to us, he'll be able to go back for some dessert and wine. It's the beauty of Zoom, being able to interrupt your dinner party to do just a tiny bit of work. All right, today we're here to talk about The Art of Hearing Heartbeats trilogy. The first book, The Art of Hearing Heartbeats. The second book, A Well-Tempered Heart. And the third book, The Heart Remembers, is just out from Other Press. Jan-Philipp Sendker lives in Berlin, as I mentioned. He was born and raised in Hamburg, and he has been a magazine correspondent for the magazine Stern, both the American and Asian correspondent. He's also the author of Whispering Shadows and a nonfiction book, Cracks in the Great Wall, about China. He's going to talk to us a little bit today about the book and about his international travels that might have inspired his work. So thank you all again for joining us. If you have any questions that come up, you can type those into the chat, or you can raise your hand and address the author at the end yourself. So we'll launch right into this and save some time for questions at the end. Jan-Philipp Sendker, thank you so much for joining us. How are you doing?
Thank you very much for this very kind introduction. I'm doing well, and I'm all excited to be with you here. It's really strange sitting in Berlin at a dinner party and saying, you know, I have to go to Albuquerque now, but I'll be back in an hour or so. It's strange, even though I prefer coming in person. I love events with people, and I look at people and see them looking at me. And I think the personal interaction afterwards, they ask questions, I sign books. I really prefer that, but this is much better than nothing. So I really appreciate everybody who takes his or her time to watch this, listen to this now, or maybe a little later when you post it, put it online. I know this is in the middle of the day in Albuquerque. You probably have better things to do, go swimming or whatever, or hiking, than listening to me, but who does? I really appreciate it. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you. It's good to cool off. We're getting hot here. Our summertime heat wave has started, so it's actually a great time to talk about a little literature. So for those of us or the viewers who may or may not be aware of your trilogy, do you want to tell us a little bit about where it's set and where you maybe got the idea for it?
Yeah, I very often I'm being asked, why does a German author write a whole trilogy set in Burma, or Myanmar, how it's called now? And it is a strange story. As you said, in my previous professional life, I was a journalist. I was a foreign correspondent for a German weekly based in New York for 8 years. And then I got transferred to Asia and became the Hong Kong bureau chief, and was based in Hong Kong and covering China, Japan, Southeast Asia. I was pretty busy. It was in 1995, actually. There were a lot of things going on. There was a big earthquake in Japan, and then a gas attack in the subway. China was opening up. So I was really busy. And don't ask me why. I wanted to go to Burma. And in those days, nobody wanted to go to Burma. It was no man's land in Southeast Asia. There was a military government, pretty brutal, incompetent, corrupt. And for many, many years, from 1960 to, I think, the mid-80s, you couldn't even get a visa, only for a week. And in the early 90s, they started to open up, but still nobody went. I mean, no tourists, no journalists, no politicians, no NGOs, whatever. Burma was a little bit like North Korea, just with better weather. And I wanted to go. And it was a little bit, some of my Burmese friends that strongly believed that I was a Burmese in a previous life. That's why I feel so drawn to that country and culture. I don't know if I buy into that, but there was kind of this inner voice which told me, go to Burma. And eventually I could convince Stern to send me there. And it was in May 1995, but I didn't know that May is the hottest month. So it's really probably like in Albuquerque, the hottest month, but with 100% humidity. And there's just an hour flight from Bangkok, the capital of Thailand, to Yangon, that was the capital in Burma in those days. It's just a brief flight. and I got into this plane at Boeing 737. It was almost empty. And then we flew. It was late afternoon, early evening. It was almost dark, and we flew over Yangon, approaching the runway. And Yangon is a big city. There are 7 million people living there, and it was basically dark. It was like not flying over Albuquerque now, but maybe a suburb or something. There were no lights. And I thought, whoa, that's strange. And we touched down and we got off the plane. I remember the bus, there was a bus parked between the terminal, which was rather small, probably like Bookworks, like a shop or something really small. And our plane, the bus didn't move because it was broken. So we had to walk. Took a little while until we got into the country. And me and maybe 20 other passengers, and we were looking for cars. There were a few really old rundown cars available, and I got into one, and very slowly we drove into town. And I realized I had flown 1 hour, but I had traveled 80 years back in time. And nowadays I see what a privilege that was. I think it's basically impossible nowadays with the internet, and we're also connected, unless you visit a tribe in the Amazon or something. But visiting a big country, Burma is bigger than Texas. It's bigger than Germany and France combined. There are 53 million people living there. And I could go into there and travel back 80 years in time. There were basically no cars on the streets. There were people walking. Men were all wearing longies. Kids were playing on the streets. Men were walking, holding hands. There were lots of monks. There were no neon signs. Most stores were closed. It was so quiet. The only thing I heard was the human voice. And I was so puzzled because I had just been to Bangkok, this lively, big city in Southeast Asia. And now I'm here 1 hour later, and it's so different. And completely surprised, I asked my driver if there was a McDonald's in town. And he kept driving, and then he turned around and said very politely, "McDonald's, you said? Is the guy maybe Scottish?" He had no clue what McDonald's was. And I realized this is really different here. And I just put my stuff into the hotel room. And then I walked, and the streets were still full. It was dark now, but there were still markets going on, and people, were sitting in tea houses and walking and chatting and on sidewalks. And then I heard a very strange sound, and it got all dark. There was a blackout. And that happens a lot still today. But nowadays, when it happens in Yangon, it only takes a few seconds, and then you hear from all over the strange sound, like the generators, they jumpstart. In those days, people didn't have any generators. So the whole neighborhood was dark. But people knew what to do. They were used to it. So they lit candles, and they put these candles on tables and in door frames and window frames on the sidewalk. So after a little while, the whole neighborhood, I had the feeling the whole city was just lit by candles. It was a magical atmosphere. And from all over, I heard sounds again, the human voice, because there were no cars at all and no electric noises, because there was no power. And just whispering, people laughing, yelling, crying, talking, and singing. That was the most amazing thing. I heard people singing. And I followed the song, and sometimes ended up at a riverbank or in a park or in a courtyard. And it was always the same. There was a young man and a young woman, and the man, sometimes he was playing guitar and he was singing songs. And only later did I learn that this was a Burmese tradition. And a young couple, they fall in love, and in those days there was not much to do. They just sat there, and the guy was singing love songs to the girl. And I found that so romantic, so moving. I just listened to it and thought, my God, am I lucky that this is not a German tradition, because I would still be single. I cannot sing at all. My kids can stand when I sing the nighttime songs. So, but I enjoyed it very much. And I stayed for 3 weeks in that country. And it was an amazing experience. As a foreign correspondent, I had been to maybe 70, 80 different countries, never to a place like Burma. Life was hard. That was pretty obvious very soon. The life expectancy, the average is 50, 52 in those days, not much higher now. It still is a very poor country. Life is hard, can be very tough, very unfair, unjust, especially in those days, and now again with the military in charge. But people didn't complain, and they carried their burden with such dignity. They were so hospitable, so friendly. They were so warm to the outsider. It was amazing. I felt welcomed. I was moved very often on my first trip, and I have been back, I don't know, 30 times since then, since 1995, every year, sometimes twice, sometimes 3 times, because it touched me so much. And my books are set there, so I have to do a lot of research. And it was sometimes magical. Sometimes it was very rough. Sometimes I really hit a wall because I couldn't understand what was going on. There was one instance when I interviewed 3 young men, and they were used as porters by the military. And you have to know, in Burma, there are 135 ethnic minorities. The largest are the Burmese, and there's some big ones like the Paos, the Palong, the Shan, the Karen, Kachin. There are millions of people. And some of them want independence. So basically in Burma, there has been a civil war going on in parts of the country since its independence in 1948. And especially in the 80s, 90s, it was a very rough, very brutal war. They used a lot of landmines, and the military didn't have enough landmine detectors. So what did they do? They used humans. They used young men, they kidnapped them basically. They surrounded whole villages, took all the young men away, and used them as landmine detectors or sweepers. They had to go ahead in the jungle and the rice paddies. They stepped on a landmine, the mine exploded, the man was gone, and so was the landmine. Nobody does that voluntarily, of course. So, as I said, they surrounded some villages and kidnapped these young people, and only a few survived. And I was, through contacts and some luck research, I met 3 young men who had survived that, who escaped. And they told me their story. And I wanted to write a story about them for Stern. Stern wasn't interested. I was devastated. I put all my notes in a box. And when I wrote A Well-Tempered Heart, I knew this is the time to use these stories. And their stories are a big part in A Well-Tempered Heart. What the main character Tata experiences is what they experienced. So in the end, people learned about what happened to them. But in those days, I did the research and they told me their stories. I was absolutely, I got so angry at the soldiers who did that to them. And at one point I said, you must hate them. And they said, oh no, it was our fault. I said, what? How was it your fault? Oh, they said, that was our karma. We must have done something terrible in a previous life so that we deserve this. So that's a very fundamental, very basic Buddhism. And I thought, are you crazy? I mean, you were tortured, you were mistreated, there are perpetrators and they have to be prosecuted and brought to justice. No, they said, it's our karma. And those are moments where I really reached my limit as coming from the West with a different background, different values. Think, no, this is a crime. And these people have to brought to justice and put in jail, but they couldn't believe what I said and I couldn't believe what they said. So there are instances where really cultures clash. And as I said, I've been there so many times and I've tried to understand, I ask questions, I listen. And there are moments where I don't get it. And I think this experience basically is very similar to what my main character in these 3 books, Julia, experiences. She is an American lawyer from New York, completely different upbringing, but her father is Burmese. So she has some Burmese background, and in the Art of Ring Heartbeats, her father disappears. She's searching for him. She meets Uba in Kalaw, this beautiful town in the Shan states in Burma. And then in the second book, she goes again. She's searching for herself in A Well-Tempered Heart, and now the heart remembers. I will talk about it a little in a little while. But First, I would like to describe a big change in Burma, because that was another very moving, emotional experience for me to see how this country, these people woke up. It was like a big awakening. There was fear, there was a military government, and then in 2010, they opened up. They had a different regime. They had still a general as their head of state, but he opened up in 2015. They had democratic elections, and Aung San Suu Kyi, the opposition leader, got in charge. And these 10 years between 2010 and 2020 were amazing. I was there so often because I couldn't believe it. All of a sudden, the fear was gone. And to see people waking up without fear, when they had lived with fear for so many years, it is an amazing. I still feel it such a privilege to have witnessed that and to have been there so often and for so much time. How it changes, how people, they were so thirsty for what was going on in the outside world. And they were thirsty for knowledge. You could see that in Yangon, there were signs all over for Japanese lessons and English lessons and IT lessons. And I was approached, my books all of a sudden were published in Burma. I mean, I never dreamed of it, because the first one is an enchanting love story. The second one is much more contemporary and political. And the third one, The Heart Remembers, as well. And now they were being published in Burma. And I went to Burma on reading tours. And I had hundreds of people in front of me asking questions, discussing things. We even discussed, I remember we had one reading that was broadcast on radio live. And there was a girl standing up, and she said she read A Well-Tempered Heart, and she read about this Porter thing and how the military was mistreating the people. And she wanted to know if that was true or if I all made it up. I thought, my gosh, that's a sensitive question. A couple of years earlier, she would have gone to jail, and me too, just, for answering this question. And I thought, but no, she is, and now this is on radio. And said, no, I didn't make it up. That's what happened. That's what the military did. And then we discussed that, what the military did. That was all possible before this new coup 3 months ago. So that was really an incredible experience, seeing people, Burmese people, reading my books. I remember one reading in Kalaw. How special is that? I talk about my books in Kalaw, where they are set. And there were people coming from Yangon, which is a 10-hour bus ride, by the way. They did that just to listen to me and got books signed. And there was a Burmese young man. He spoke a little English. He came with the books in Burmese and wanted me to sign them. And he said in his broken English that he loved my books very much for 3 reasons. First reason, they make him cry. The second reason, they comfort him. And the third reason, he learns so much about his country through them. And I thought, wow, that is quite a compliment from a Burmese. So it's because I've been there so many times. I have so good friends, really some very good friends who help me translate the language, the culture. So I try to understand what's going on without judging. And within these last 10 years, the new novel, A Well-Tempered Heart, is set. Basically, it's between 2019 and 2007. And it's about a little boy. He's called Kobobo. He's 12, and he lives with his uncle, Uba. And his father comes once a year. He lives in Yangon, but only once a year. Then his uncle disappears, and his mother never shows up. And why she doesn't show up, why his father only comes once a year, he doesn't know. And he doesn't dare to ask. It's kind of a family secret. And I tell you something, it doesn't matter whether you're in America, in Germany, or in Burma, nobody likes to talk about family secrets. That's why they are called secrets. So it's a sensitive topic. He doesn't ask, and especially Burmese don't ask questions much anyhow. So he keeps quiet. He misses his father and his mother. But he lives with his uncle, and they are very close. It's kind of they love each other. And again, Burma is a big inspiration there, because a friend of mine, she lives with her grandma, and whenever I visited her, I noticed how much she took care of her grandma. Once I came and she was washing her grandma's hair in the backyard. And then she clipped her fingertails and her toe tails, and then the grandma had stomach aches, and then she gave her massage. So it was so it was wonderful to see how kind, how with such tenderness she treated her grandma. And she told me that's, in Burma, there are no homes for the elderlies. And there are no people from other countries you hire to take care of the old. Who does it? The family. And who does it in the family? Usually the young. So it's a different relationship than here in the West. And she took care of her grandma, and Kobobo takes care of his uncle Uba, who is 80. So it's almost more like grandfather and grandchild. They've been living together for 7 years. At the beginning, of course, Uba took care of Kobobo, but now it's changing. Uba is getting old. And one day, Bobo wakes up in the middle of the night. Usually they sleep together in one bed, and Uba is not next to him. So he is irritated, but then he hears a strange sound from the living room. He gets up and watches, looks around the door frame, and then he sees Uba in the middle of the night in front of a typewriter, typing. There's a candle next to it. And Kobo was very surprised. He goes back to bed, and next morning, Uba is sound asleep. Kobobo gets up and searches the whole hut. And eventually he finds a typewriter and some notes. And he knows he is not supposed to read these notes. Otherwise, Uba wouldn't write them in the middle of the night secretly. But of course, he is very curious. He would love to know what Uba is writing, what Uba is hiding from him. And in the end, he is too curious. He starts to read. And I only would like to read the first 10 sentences of whatever Uba wrote down. And Kobobo is reading anxiously. They demanded a courage of themselves beyond the strength of their hearts. By the time they realized their mistake, it was already too late. She had no plan but a dream. He had neither one nor the other. He was afraid. And of course, fear is the natural enemy of love. A person who loves has no fear. A person who fears cannot love, only cling. Both were prisoners in their own worlds who believed they could free one another if only they loved sufficiently. Love can accomplish many miracles, but it could not fulfill this hope, a hope as old as love itself. So he reads that and he knows that's the story of his parents. And all of a sudden, Uba is standing in front of him, very angry for Kobobo reading it. But now Kobobo wants to know. He wants to know the story of his parents. And Uba is telling him the story of Julia and Tata. But of course, I don't want to give it away. I just tell you, The Heart Remembers is a book about love, but maybe it's the most complex book of these 3 books because it deals with the different forms and phases of love. It's not just between Julia and Tata, husband and wife. It's also about the love between a child and his parents. It's also about the love between Kobobo and Uba, crossing generations, grandchild, grandfather. So it's a different form and phases of love. So maybe, I think it's the most challenging, the most complex book of these 3. I hope I got you a little curious, and I'm happy to answer any questions you have.
Okay. If you have questions, you can put them in the chat or you can raise your hand and I will call on you. Thank you so much for that intro to your books and for some background about your travels. You've talked a lot about love, and of course, that's an overarching theme in your book. There's also a heavy grain of spirituality and an incorporation of the culture of Burma into your book through spirit and religions. Can you talk a little bit about that, about your own practice or not, and how you research that aspect of the Burmese culture to include in your book?
Yes, sure. Religion or spirituality is such an important part in Burmese life. Most of them are Buddhists. There are also some Christians. There's also Muslims. but the huge majority, 90% are Buddhist. And Buddhism is such part of their lives because at any given time, you have more than 500,000 monks in the country. And it's not just like in Christianity with the Catholics, you become a monk for the rest of your life or whatever. And then you live among monks and you stay there. In Burma, you become a monk a couple of times in your lifetime, if you like. You can be a monk for a day or a week or a year or 5 years, whatever you like. And there's a constant exchange between the monkhood and the normal, the society. And people usually become monks when they are like 13, 14 for a week. Women, girls as well. For men, it's basically mandatory. Girls sometimes do it, most of the time they don't, but you see lots of nuns as well. And there's a constant exchange. And I think that's what it makes so lively. And that's why the Buddhist thought is so ingrained in the society, because there's this exchange. It's not dead somewhere, teached in an empty church or whatever. No, it's people go to monasteries, they pray there, they bring their offerings, they have chats with the monks, or they visit their uncle, their father, their brother, or whatever, and they stay there. And when you are like the Shwedagon Pagoda, it's wonderful. It's the in Yangon, the most important pagoda in all of Burma. And it's such a lively scene. All families come there, they do picnics and the kids play around, and it's really part of their life. Buddhism and their thinking, his thoughts are really part of their life. And at the same time, they are very superstitious. The astrologer is a very important part in a town or in a village. And I realized that they are very superstitious. And I tell you one story, which really made me think. And again, sometimes I put myself into Julia's shoes when I wrote it, because what she experienced, I experienced to a certain extent, this confusion, this, being challenged by different ways of thinking. I remember when I did research for A Well-Tempered Heart, it was for The Uttering Heartbeats, actually. So it was in 1999. I went to an astrologist and I just wanted to see how it works. I didn't used to be superstitious. I was very rational. I didn't believe in the stars and horoscope and all that, all bullshit, I thought. So I went there because I just wanted to experience it. Since I wanted to write about it, I thought I need the experience. And I went to a very well-known one in Kalaw with my Burmese friend, and I gave him my birthday and time and location. And my question was whether my book I was supposed to write would be a success. And he had a little chalkboard and took notes and did some calculations. And then he said, oh, don't worry, the book is going to be a big success. I smiled and thought, that's nice. I like to hear that. But since I didn't believe it, I just wanted to prove him wrong. And not by writing a shitty book, but I wanted to prove him wrong just on the spot. And I gave him the time and the location and the day of a little child in the family, distant family. I knew he had an eye disease. And the guy, he did his calculation. The boy was 2.5 at that time. And then he didn't smile. And he said, oh, this kid causes some worries for his parents. That, okay, in the West, that's not unusual. So maybe you can be more specific. And he did more calculations and he said, he has health problems. Okay, that's unusual for a 2.5-year-old. But again, I didn't believe anything. And I said, but can you be more precise? Yeah, but this takes time. And he consulted some books and did more calculations. And then he said, yes, health problems in his head. And now I got goosebumps and I thought, wow, do you know even more? I said, yeah, wait. He did some calculations and he said, in his eyes. And it blew me away. There was no way this man could have known that this boy had health eye problems. It blew me away. I thought that the earth was shaking. And up until today, I can't make sense of this. It happened And I know I think Uber says it in one book, not everything which is true you can explain, and not everything you can explain is true. So I don't know. I remember I was in Israel on a reading tour, and I met a very famous physicist. And I said, you're a natural scientist. I tell you this story. You tell me, you give me an explanation. And I told him the story, and he said, oh, that's easy. The guy could read your mind. And yeah, I tell you, as a physicist, I know there are a lot of waves we can't measure yet. Eventually, we might be able, but he could catch your waves. And I thought, wow, that's an interesting explanation, because of course, the whole time I was sitting in front of him, I was thinking of the eye problems of this boy. Maybe that is an explanation. Maybe there's another one. But hey, that leads you into a very different territory, and Burma is full of these stories. And on my first trips, I thought, yeah, ridiculous, I know. But now, no, there are lots of stories you can't explain, and they are all, I mean, they are part of my books, definitely.